Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here tonight, and thank you very much for the introduction. So we can straight dive into our today's topic, which is how liquidation preference, valuation, and anti-dilution have an impact on your exit. So we came up with this topic because what we see quite often in practice is that in financing rounds, founders very much focus on the valuation. The reason for this is probably that the valuation has a very direct and obvious impact on how the cap table will look after the financing round. So it's very clear. The higher the valuation, the less an investor gets for a certain investment amount. So founders obviously try to push the valuation as high as possible. However, for a founder, it is very important to understand that if a founder holds, for example, 50% at the time of the exit of the company, it does not mean, in any case, that such founder will receive 50% of the purchase price for the company. And the reason for this are mainly liquidation preferences. Against this background, it is sometimes a bit surprising for us that we see very tough negotiations on the valuation, and when it comes to liquidation preferences, there is only very little discussion about that. So, but first, have a bit a closer look at the pre-money valuation. I mean, I'm not saying that the valuation is not important. Of course, the valuation is very important, and the share in a company is not only important when it comes to the distribution of the exit proceeds, but we also see quite often that certain rights are linked to a certain shareholding of an investor in a company. So for example, what we see is that maybe 5%, 10%, 15% entitle a investor to certain rights, as for example, to appoint a board member or to appoint a board observer or to special information rights. So of course, the valuation and therefore also the share an investor holds in the company is very important. But as I said before, founders should bear in mind that the share of an investor is not the only relevant factor when it comes to the distribution of the exit proceeds. So let's have a closer look at the liquidation preference. In general, we can distinguish between two main categories. Of course, there are certain mixes between them and also certain changes, but in principle, we can distinguish between the non-participating liq pref and the participating liq pref. So with the non-participating liq pref, the investor basically says that he or she wants at least get back the preference amount. And let's assume, for the purposes of this speech, that the preference amount equals to the investment amount. So this means that if an investor invests 1 million francs and he receives 10%, in case of an exit, investor will either receive the 10% of the exit price or he will receive the 1 million, his investment amount, whichever is higher. So in our example, let's assume that such company is sold for 5 million. If we do not have a liq pref at all, this would mean that the investor will get 10% of the 5 million, which is 500,000. In case we do have a non-participating liq pref, the investor will get, in such example, not only the 500,000, but he will get his investment amount back. So he will get the 1 million. So with the non-participating liq pref, the investor makes sure that he at least gets back what he invested. Very different from that is the participating liq pref. With the participating liq pref, investor receives first the investment amount back, his preference amount, and after that he participates again on the remaining proceeds with whichever shareholding he has, so with the 10, 15, 20%, whatever the investor has. So this mechanism is therefore also often referred to as double dip, because the investor kind of dips in twice, right? So he first gets back the amount that he invested. And once he had that back, then when we distribute the remaining proceeds, he dips again with this percentage that he holds in the company. So the concept is very different between those two liquidation preferences. So let's have a quick look at those two examples. When we look at the left example and the right example and we compare it, and if we focus very much on the pre-money valuation, what is done quite often in practice, and we ignore kind of that we changed on the left side from a non-participating liq pref to a participating liq pref on the right side. So when we just look at the valuation, the right side example looks much, much better for the founders because we have a much higher valuation. So on the left side, we have 10 millions. On the right side, we have a pre-money valuation of 18 millions, so almost double, 80% higher. Investment amount is the same, 2 millions. Exit price, 24 millions, is also the same. But we have the non-participating liq pref on the left side, participating liq pref on the right side. So when we look at the result, which is at first sight quite surprising, although the valuation on the right side is much higher, investor is better off with the right side compared to the left side. So the switch from the non-participating to the participating liq pref overcompensates in this example the higher valuation that we have on the right side. So let's quickly do the math. On the left side, we have a pre-money valuation of 10 millions. Investment amount is 2 millions. Therefore, the post-money valuation is 10 plus 2, which is 12. Even easy for a lawyer to calculate. Then we have, so the investor invested 2 millions out of the 12, which is 1/6, which is 16.7%. Exit price is 24 million. What we've seen before, what we now compare is the investment amount, which is 2 millions, with the amount the investor would get if he would just participate with the 16.7% in the exit price. So 16.7% of the 24 millions is 4 millions. So 4 millions is higher than 2 millions. So the investor will get the 4 millions on the left side example. Let's have a quick look on the right side. So here we have the much higher pre-money valuation. We have the 18 millions. The investment amount is still the same. We have the 2 millions. Post-money, therefore, is 20. 18 plus 2, 20. So investor invested 2 out of 20 millions. So he ends up with 10%. So here we can see the effect of the valuation, right? So on the right side, we have the investor only gets 10%. On the left side, investor gets 16.7%. Reason for that is that we have a much higher pre-money valuation on the right side. And so when we look at how the participating liq pref is calculated, so the investor first receives back the investment amount from these 24 millions. So if we deduct 2 millions from these 24 millions, 22 millions are left. From these remaining proceeds, the investor gets again 10%, which is 2.2 millions. So we end up with the 4.2 millions. So this is why, and just because of the switch from non-participating to participating liq pref, the higher valuation still leads to a better result for the investor. Of course, it's not always the case that a higher valuation will be overcompensated by a particular liq pref. It also depends on other factors, in particular on the exit price. So if we quickly have a look at the next slide. So here, what we've done compared to the example here, we increased the exit price up to 100 millions. So if we would have an exit price with 100 millions, then on the left side, the investor would end up with 16.7 billion, and on the right side, only with 11.8 millions. So here, the liq pref does not overcompensate the higher valuation that we have on the right side. But the point I'm making here is that founders really should do, and they should do that already during the negotiations with the investors, model calculations. They should think of different scenarios. What happens if we have an exit price of 20, 30, 40, 50 millions? What happens if we have different valuations? And this will help the investors or the founders to get the best results possible. So now Christoph will talk about anti-dilution protection. Anti-dilution can change the cap table and therefore also can have an impact on the distribution of the purchase price.
Thank you, Peter. Let's talk about anti-dilution protection and its correlation with the down round. A down round is when the issue price of the financing round is lower than the issue price of the previous financing round. This has the consequence that the investors of the previous round are financially diluted. To prevent this, investors often wish to include a so-called anti-dilution protection in the shareholders' agreement. In practice, two standard types of such clauses have been established, where one type can be divided into two subcategories. In general, we distinguish between full ratchet and weighted average anti-dilution protection, whereas the latter being further divided into narrow-based and broad-based. But I will come back later to the differences. Anti-dilution protection works in such way that in case of a down round, the investors of the previous round will be entitled to receive additional shares, either by share capital increase or by transfer of shares from the founders. In order to illustrate the different types of anti-dilution protection, I would like to show you a few different scenarios and its impact on the shareholding, based on a simple example. So, we start as follows. The founders and investor 1 have agreed on a pre-money valuation of 4.5 million. Investor 1 invests 500,000. Founders 1 and 2 have 45,000 shares each, which corresponds to 45% of the share capital. With his investment of 500,000, investor 1 receives 10,000 shares, which corresponds to 10% of the share capital. Now, 18 months later, the company needs additional funding. Unfortunately, the company did not develop as expected and hoped by the parties, and the pre-money valuation of such round 2 is now only 2.5 million. So the so-called down round takes place. A second investor, here referred as investor 2, invests additional 500,000. But investor 1 does not participate this time. As a result, investor 1 is diluted from his 10% to 8.33% of the share capital, despite having invested the same amount as investor 2, who now holds 16.67% of the share capital. For this reason, investor 1 wants to protect himself from being fully diluted. Therefore, in practice, as mentioned before, an anti-dilution protection is very often agreed between the founders and the investors in the shareholder agreement. The question is, however, how the anti-dilution protection should be structured. The next slides shall therefore show you the impact on the different anti-dilution protection clauses. To make things easier, we have assumed that the shares to which investor 1 is entitled to must be transferred from the founders to investor 1. So, in this scenario, the founders and investor 1 have agreed on the so-called full ratchet anti-dilution protection. This means that investor 1 shall be treated as he or she would have invested based on the lower issue price of round 2, thus at 2.5 million. This leads to the following. Investor 1 will not be financially diluted and keeps his 16.67% of the share capital, which puts him on equal footing with investor 2. As he receives his additional shares from the founders, they bear the full dilution and now only hold 33.33% of the share capital, here highlighted in red. As you can see, a full ratchet anti-dilution dilution completely protects investor 1. However, the effects are very negative for the founders. Therefore, from a founder's perspective, a full ratchet anti-dilution protection should not be accepted and rarely occurs in practice in early-stage funding. Founders will especially argue that the risks of a down round should also be borne by the investors to a certain extent. Here in our example, investor 1, since they will also profit from rising valuations. In practice, the parties therefore often agree on weighted average anti-dilution protections. In this scenario, the founders and investor 1 have agreed on the broad-based weighted average anti-dilution protection. This means that investor 1 shall be treated as he or she would have invested based on an issue price between the issue price of round 1 and round 2. The numbers of shares that investor 1 receives is determined by the calculation formula shown here on the right side. But don't worry, I won't go into details about the calculation here. But as you can see, investor 1 is now diluted to 11.57%. The founders, however, do not bear the entire dilution. Each founder is only diluted to 35.88%. So, now let's assume that the founders and investors have agreed on the narrow-based weighted average anti-dilution protection. This also has the objective that investor 1 shall be treated as he or she would have invested based on an issue price between the issue price of round 1 and round 2. Compared to the broad-based weighted average anti-dilution, the narrow-based leads to a more investor-friendly result. Again, I will not go into details about the calculation on the right side. But as you can see in the cap table, this leads to a higher dilution of the founders compared to the broad-based protection as seen before. Investor 1 holds now 12.51%, and each founder holds 35.41% of the share capital. So a small side note from my side, many of you are familiar with the shareholders agreement templates from SECA. So you should be aware that the light version uses the broad-based weighted average formula, while the long version uses the narrow-based. So be careful which template you are using. Especially in the current environment, where the valuations of the companies are coming under pressure and down rounds are not rarely, it is very important to realize that anti-dilution and its various types of protection clauses can have a great impact in the shareholding of the company.
Yes, so we're coming already to the conclusions. As I said before, it is important to understand the interdependencies between liquidation preference, anti-dilution protection, and valuation. This can also be very helpful in negotiations. So if you focus too much on the valuation, so I mean valuation in the end it's a figure. So maybe founders want to push for 20 millions. Investors are going to say, well, we're not going to hire than 10, so then we might meet somewhere in the middle. But when founders really understand how all these clauses relate to each other, it can also be a way out in stock negotiations. So there might be a solution to accept a bit of lower valuation, but on the other hand, shape the liquidation preference differently or have a different structure in the anti-dilution protection. So we know it's a complex topic, but we hope that we were able to show that various factors will decide on how the exit proceeds will be distributed in case of an exit. And so we wish all the founders and investors very successful negotiations. Thank you very much.
Thank you.